Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is slavery. Washington was one of 12 American presidents who was a slaveholder. There were some presidents who held only one slave or only a handful, and then there were those like Washington who held hundreds throughout their lifetime. In fact, Washington and Thomas Jefferson had more slaves than any other presidents in American history. How we reconcile what we know about slavery today, the barbarism associated with that horrific practice, and the context of the time in which it occurred makes it a very difficult scenario to process. What historians and biographers can do is provide facts and context in which we eventually then assess the legacy of these individuals. So let's get to the facts and context, including the voice of Washington, his own words, as we trace his personal evolution on the topic of slavery, both personally and politically. Washington became a slaveholder at the age of 11. His father, Augustine, passed away. His estate was divvied up. George actually got a relatively small amount, but he did inherit some land, and he inherited 10 slaves, again at the age of 11. He continued to procure slaves as he eventually actually took on more property ownership that he inherited from other family members. But the big influx of slaves into George Washington's life came when he got married to Martha Custis. She, the wealthy widow, the wealthiest woman in Virginia at the time, came with an estate of a lot of land, cash, and nearly 200 slaves. And so now there's a sprawling number who are in essence needed from the times of Washington to run his massive plantation. This was the custom of the day. There was not a southern plantation of the size and scale of Washington's land holdings that did not use slave labor to do most of the work. And again, Washington's land grew ultimately in Mount Vernon, 5 farms. He also had a grist mill, a distillery, a blacksmith, a fishing fleet. They bred some sheep, amongst many other things. And slaves did the bulk of the work in the fields as well as in the household. The house slaves were more under the auspices of Martha Washington. As she ran the house, this included the cooking and the cleaning, the valet service, the butler service. Slaves performed those functions, as well as the much more manual and labor-intensive work that, of course, happened in the fields. For Washington and his slaves, he treated them, by all accounts, fairly well. He cared for their medical conditions in part because it was self-serving for his productivity that he wanted to get out of his slaves. Clearly, their housing establishments were poor, small huts. A lot of them slept on the dirt floor in these huts, and there was punishment. While Washington was not considered to be a harsh slave owner, there were times when he said, if any of the servants will not do their duty by fair means or are impertinent, correction, as the only alternative, must be administered. This meant physical punishment. The worst offense in Washington's mind were runaways, and nearly 50 slaves in all the years that Washington had slaves, a little under 10% of his total, tried to escape and for their own freedom at one point or another, and they tended to get the harshest punishment, including a couple that he would actually sell off to kind of get him out of his hair. So generally treated well, but the living conditions were harsh, and sometimes the punishment was as well. Washington's view of slaves actually took a change based on economics in the 1760s when he decided to get out of the tobacco business. Slave labor and tobacco seemed to go hand in hand in the South, but Washington realized that tobacco was ruining his soil as it was happening elsewhere, and he decided to abandon the crop. And he pursued wheat and corn and a bunch of other grains and other things that he would grow and sell in his farms that required the services of slaves a little bit less than what he had in tobacco. Now, he still had slaves who worked the land, but frankly, the profitability of that was starting to become somewhat suspect and did inform his future thinking on sort of the need and how to acquire slaves. Washington's first position politically on slaves, in fact, one of his few positions politically, came out in 1774. This is in the spirit of the conflict with Great Britain. We're nearing a revolution, and Washington is one of the leading rebels, if you will, coming from this colony of Virginia. And he was involved in what was called the Fairfax Resolve, a statement, frankly, against the crown. But he also, in this resolve, helped add the words that during our present difficulties and distresses, no slaves ought to be imported, and we take this opportunity of declaring our earnest wishes to see an entire stop forever put to such wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. This was one of the rare times that Washington went on the record about slavery, although nothing really came from these resolves because the slave trade, of course, at the time did not stop. The following year, Washington is named as the commanding general of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War. This is June of 1775, and initially Washington was against having black-skinned people as part of his army. Even free slaves, free blacks, were not welcome initially, but Washington changed his mind, and there were a couple of reasons. The first is that the British started offering freedom for blacks who would escape from their slave masters and actually come over to the British. They saw it as advantageous to them, and they were willing to grant their freedom. And Washington didn't want that. He wanted them to stay aligned to America if they were going to be involved in this process. But he also had some strong influencers. The Marquis de Lafayette, the young general who had come over from France that Washington took so kindly to and had a close relationship with, was a strong abolitionist, as was John Laurens, a young member of his staff, one of his aides-de-camp, that really influenced Washington on his thinking, in particular about allowing blacks to serve in the Continental Army. Once Washington made that decision, a little bit into the war, a couple of years in, there were actually about 5,000 blacks who served in combat positions and a few thousand others who provided service to the Revolutionary War effort. So a little bit part of the evolving thinking of Washington. There was also during the war one presence of one slave by Washington's side at just about all times. And that was his manservant, his valet, Billy Lee, who he had acquired, brought with him from Mount Vernon. Billy Lee was at George Washington's side almost every minute of the Revolutionary War. Now, after the war, Washington returns to Mount Vernon. Again, his evolving thought on slavery. It's 1786, and he finally decides that I never mean, unless some particular circumstances should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase. It being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in the country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. Again, he's inching toward abolitionism. He's not going to buy slaves anymore, but he still has plenty, and they still operate most of the work on his farms and his plantation. He also recognizes as the time, this is in the mid-1780s, the country is in a little bit of peril. The Articles of Confederation aren't working very well. He thinks they need a stronger union. And Washington recognizes in a comment that he made, I clearly foresee that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our union by consolidating it into a common bond of principle. But Washington, once again, does not act on this. He is the president of the Constitutional Convention and never engages in the debate about slavery. He becomes president of the United States for 8 years, and he does not speak about slavery at all. In fact, even in his farewell address, where he puts some controversial topics on the table with strong opinions, he is completely silent on slavery. His feeling was that this was sort of that third rail, that if he tried to take on slavery politically, the country would fracture and the Union would break. It was almost that simple. And so he decided not to engage. He decided that for the sake of this fledgling nation that he was trying to foster, that taking on this original sin of American history of slavery was simply going to break the country apart if it was brought up and pursued. And so he decided to stay quiet. After the presidency, he continues to evolve. He's actually losing money on his slave population. Again, part of the fact that there's a lot of older and infirm slaves, there's some younger ones who are unproductive, but Washington does something that most of his fellow plantation owners would not do, is he refuses to sell slaves and break up families. He refuses. He says to a friend, to sell the overplus of slaves, I cannot because I am principled against this kind of traffic in the human species. To hire them out is almost as bad because to disperse the families, I have an aversion. This is where Washington begins to separate himself a bit from his peers. Washington cared about his pocketbook his entire life. It was almost a day that he wasn't conscious of his business holdings, including throughout the Revolutionary War. But at this stage of his life, his concerted effort is not to break up families, even though it is hurting him economically. Of course, his final statement on this topic and his final evolution comes in his will. And when Washington dies in December of 1799, he writes in his will, "Upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom." He frees his slaves. There's no founding father in the entire country who takes this act. There were many who spoke out against slavery. None freed their slaves who were slave owners. None freed their slaves in their will. Washington is an exception in this regard. And Washington, in fact, goes further. He actually identifies that for the elderly and sick, that they would be supported by his estate throughout their lives if they choose to stay. There were also those who were too young, and that they would be sent out to masters who would teach them reading, writing, and a trade, and then they would be freed at the age of 25. So he was really trying to take a look at this. In fact, he took it so seriously, he wrote in his will that, "And I do moreover most pointedly and most solemnly enjoin it upon my executors to see that this clause respecting slaves and every part thereof be religiously fulfilled at the epoch," his death, "at which it is directed to take place, without evasion, neglect, or delay." Actually, his death and then his wife's death, because this was to happen after Martha passes. This was clearly a big step, too little too late for some, but again, differentiating for George Washington than certainly his peers. Washington actually has one other element in his will, Billy Lee, the man who had been by his side throughout the Revolutionary War, through most of his presidency, despite the fact that he could barely walk because of sore knees. Billy Lee is given his freedom outright. And in fact, Washington gives him a choice in his will to stay with the estate and continue to work and be paid $30 a year, or to have his freedom. And Lee actually decides to stay and continue to work. There is a complicating factor in Washington's will. Washington only had authority over his slaves. And when he kept track of them in his notes, he would have one side of his ledger saying GW for George Washington, the other called dower. On the dower side were the slaves that belonged to Martha Custis and her estate. Even Martha Custis could not free her slaves because they didn't belong to her. The way she inherited them, they belonged to her estate, and the only way she could actually generate freedom for those slaves was to compensate her heirs. Now, the Washingtons were rich, but they were land rich and they had a lot of slave property. They weren't cash rich. So there was no way for her to really give compensation to her 4 grandchildren who ultimately inherited her slaves, and there were over 150 of them. Washington simply had no legal authority, nor did Martha, to free those slaves, and so they didn't. So Washington's total was about 123 of the slaves that he freed, which was the maximum that he could do at the time of his death. Now look, Washington was a slaveholder. This is something that the country and posterity has to deal with for the father of the country. He did take actions in the latter part of life to keep families together, to give freedom, to make sure the old and infirm and the young were cared for. These were steps that most of his peers did not take. Yet in the end, George Washington was a slaveholder of several hundred souls throughout much of his whole life, beginning at the age of 10. And that is part of the facts and context that posterity needs in order to ultimately evaluate George Washington as a whole, including as a slaveholder. That is George Washington and slavery from the life of George Washington. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.